could be fun if you want. Pensive, smart, superstitious, be glad on the feet. That could be whatever you want. You just tell me what you want and I'll do that for you. I'm not an idiot. I know how the world works. I've got $10 in my pocket. I have nothing to offer you, and I know that. But I'm too involved now. You jump, I jump, remember? I can't turn away without knowing you'll be all right. I love the way we fight. I love how smart you are. I love the weird way you stick your hands down my pants. And I love how you know what you don't want. And if it's not me, I don't check all your boxes if I'm not the one. I get it.
So you gonna kiss me now?
In his horrendous review of the film Obsession, YouTuber Alex Myers makes the case that the film's villain, Bear, is not so different from any of the other protagonists we used to adore in the romantic comedies we grew up loving. That many of us, women included, have made the wish that someone we are head over heels for would love us. And you know what, he's not too far off. That is absolutely true. Most of us did do that. But the question is, did you ever grow up? The older we get and the more life experience we have, the more accountable we become to our actions, because we have a greater awareness of their potential consequences. We grow out of the fantasy that real life is like the movies we grew up watching. These movies present cliches like dramatic confessions, kisses in the rain, and playing music outside someone's house as essential components of cinematic love. Obsession at First Glance is another installment in a large lineup of supernatural horror films produced in the last 20 years. And there have been some great ones. However, where Obsession stands out is in its understanding of what real-life villainy looks like. The entity in this film taking over Nikki's body, while absolutely destructive to both her and the people around her, is not simply some outside force which the characters have to defeat. It's one that has been conjured, fed, and saturated by the selfish desires of the film's true villain, who is a depressed, shy, and passive young man in his mid-20s who has a crush on his friend. I doubt many of us will ever encounter the supernatural in this earthly life, but I'm willing to bet that almost everyone watching this has met a bear. And that's what makes Obsession one of the most unsettling horror films I've seen in recent years. Because beneath its blood, gore, and dark comedy lies something painfully recognizable. It's a story about agency, about entitlement, loneliness. It shows what happens when another human being stops existing as a person and only as the fulfillment of someone else's fantasy. Obsession opens with a single focused shot of Bear as he is confessing his love for a girl. In the vein of countless rom-com leading men before him, his confession is sappy, filled with fantastical language, and dare I say, even somewhat endearing. And we, as an audience, are drawn into the moment as the music swells. The two gaze into each other's eyes.
That's
No, stop. Okay, that was cringy.
Oh my god, I knew it.
Way too much.
I'm so sorry.
We discover that the woman listening isn't the girl he's talking about at all. She's simply a waitress, standing in while Bear practices confessing his love for his friend Nikki. His friend Ian is sitting close by the whole time, observing and critiquing his entire approach. And it becomes quickly apparent that Bear is not the charming knight in shining armor typical of a leading man. He is shown to have low self-esteem, limited experience when it comes to romance, and a level of carelessness for how his actions affect others. This opening signals to a few important things about the film. The first is that Bear will be the main architect of the story that lies ahead. The second is that much of how it plays out will be due to panic, inaction, and indecision on his part. And third is that much of what we see on the surface of this narrative will ultimately be a simple fantasy, concealing a more complex, darker reality. It's also important to note that with Bear as the main protagonist aside, the story begins entirely through the perspective of men in general. He is the emotional center in this scene, trying to become comfortable in his own skin while also being vulnerable. Ian is critiquing his confession and helping craft his approach to asking out Nikki. This waitress exists in this moment as a stand-in to help facilitate Bear's arc. The moment she offers genuine advice, telling Bear that she actually liked the sincerity of his speech, Ian dismisses her almost instantly, because her usefulness to them has expired. She was valuable only as a substitute Nikki, but not as herself. And Bear also readily dismisses her when he determines from Ian's demeanor that she's no longer valuable. In these few moments, Obsession is echoing the long-standing tradition of stories being framed from the perspective of men. They are the heroes, the chosen ones. They drive the plot forward. Women often become the reward, the love interest, and the emotional support for the men. Film theorist Laura Mulvey famously described this as the male gaze, the tendency for cinema to position audiences to see women primarily through the perspective of heterosexual men. Whether or not every individual film fits that framework perfectly, it's undeniable that many stories have historically centered men's desires while treating women more as narrative objects than fully realized subjects. That's important because Obsession begins by looking exactly like one of those stories. It wants us to settle into familiar expectations, to expect Bear's happy ending. But when his big moment finally comes, and Nikki directly asks him if he has feelings for her, he lies and bails out at the last minute. In this moment, Bear's fear of rejection outweighs his desire to be in a relationship with Nikki. He would rather preserve the fantasy that Nikki might choose him rather than facing the possible reality of her not wanting him. It would force him to ask the question, as most people do when rejected by someone.
What's so bad about being with me?
And that's exactly why Bear works both as a protagonist and villain. He isn't some mustache-twirling cartoon of a bad guy plotting to control women. He's ordinary. There are people watching who can see themselves in him. The destruction and chaos he causes is masked by fear, passivity, and self-hatred. If Bear had been more openly misogynistic from the beginning, most audiences would simply distance themselves from him, and there would be no push for the self-examination that this film calls for. Now, on the other end of the misogynistic coin is Bear's friend Ian. And unlike him, he radiates confidence, or at least something that looks like confidence. He believes he understands women. He tells Bear his confession is too soft, too emotional, too nice. According to Ian, Bear needs to be more aggressive, maybe even a little mean. Now, if you spend enough time online, you'll hear countless variations of similar advice. Don't text back too quickly. Don't seem desperate. Be emotionally unavailable. I think the worst one I've heard is that women like jerks, which, of course, is an oversimplification. Many people, regardless of gender, are drawn to someone who seems comfortable with themselves, but they often get confused because confidence, even false confidence, can be attractive. Unfortunately, arrogance can masquerade as confidence just long enough to fool people, which is part of the tragedy. Ultimately, the answer to loneliness isn't becoming cruel, nor is it believing that kindness earns you romantic success. Because no amount of niceness can manufacture chemistry, and no one owes another person attraction. Unfortunately, this is a truth that people like Bear are unable to accept. So when Bear uses the one wish Willow to unwittingly make Nikki fall in love with him, he carelessly has also disregarded her own personal needs, desires, and agency. The one thing that would actually give love meaning in a genuine relationship is stripped away in this moment, and that is choice. For a brief moment, Bear has everything he ever wanted. He and Nikki are finally together. She shows him affection. She wants to spend all of her time with him. The sequences showing them as a couple really have all the trappings of the classic cinematic love that rom-coms sold us. And if this were a traditional romance story, this would probably be where it ends. But this one is asking way more questions than that classic story ever would. One of my favorite definitions of love comes from philosopher Erich Fromm, who argued that love is not something that happens to us, but something we actively choose to practice. Whether or not you agree with every aspect of his philosophy, I think he's right about one thing. Choice is what gives love its meaning. After all, if someone is physically incapable of leaving you, is their affection genuine? If someone is forced to tell you everything you want to hear, do those words mean anything? If someone has literally no other option than to choose you, have they actually chosen you at all? And these are questions that Obsession keeps asking, not verbally but visually, through conversations between the characters, even through something as simple as the film's score. One of the things I started to notice was that during scenes of romance, the music tends to swell up, as it would in a film like The Notebook or Titanic, then gradually become darker as we get pulled out of the fantasy and into reality. And indeed, because this fantasy is unsustainable without the consent of both people, reality does start to seep in very quickly. Nikki's initial appearance as the perfect new girlfriend begins to show cracks as she attempts to sustain the fantasy. She lies about her father having cancer in order to gain Bear's sympathy and keep him from leaving her. She reacts strangely whenever Bear questions her. She watches him while he sleeps. She panics whenever he leaves. Her behavior becomes stranger and stranger, evolving from appearing slightly off in the beginning to wreaking complete havoc by the end. One of the most insane scenes in this film happens when Bear comes home from work and realizes that Nikki hasn't moved from the spot she was in. She's been standing there, waiting the whole time. She's covered in sweat, she's vomited on herself, she's defecated herself, she's completely deteriorated. I've seen some people laugh at this scene because it's so grotesque. Which it is. But underneath the shock value is one of the saddest images in the film. I mean, she literally cannot have a life outside him anymore. Without Bear, there is now no Nikki. She exists now only as a passenger in her own body, but not an agent. She's literally no more alive than Bear's dead cat, whose remains Nikki uses to make Bear a sandwich. Which is both absurd and disgusting, but also strangely logical. Because if Nikki only exists to make Bear happy, then morality no longer matters. Nothing about her life, feelings, or actions really matter. Even Sandy, the cat, is reduced into another tool she uses for pleasing Bear. But the catch is that none of this is Nikki's fault, because it's not really her acting on genuine feelings for Bear. Rather, it is Bear's obsession with the idea of them together that is manifesting through this entity that has taken over her body. And as a result, the real Nikki is sinking further and further away below the surface. I think it's very telling that we only get to spend about 10 minutes of screen time with the real Nikki. We learn some surface level things about her, or at least who she presents herself as. She's pretty confident, generally seems very kind, and she wants to be a writer. But most of what we actually learn about her comes through what Bear learns about her while she is under his spell. He learns her genuine feelings about him, that she sees him as a little brother. He learns about her toxic relationship with her father. He learns that she's been hooking up with Ian for years. And each new revelation is like a gut punch, because it contradicts everything he's previously idealized about Nikki. It not only makes her more complex and human to him, but as a result also chips away at the bubble he's been living in with her. That is why the real horror of this movie isn't what Nikki does. It's what she loses. Before the wish, she had a life. She had friends, complicated relationships, secrets, dreams. She exists independently of Bear. But after the wish, those things begin to disappear as everything becomes organized around one purpose. Bear. Every instinct, every decision, every emotion now exists solely in relation to him, not because she wants to, because she has to, but just because this new entity is taking over her body does not mean that the real Nikki is completely gone. Rather, she is trapped. It becomes horrifyingly clear as the film goes on that she has been experiencing everything, watching, unable to stop herself. It forced us to imagine living inside your own body, unable to control your words, unable to control your actions, and watching yourself hurt everyone you love. It's completely horrifying. And when it gets to be too much, Nikki begs Bear to kill her and end her suffering. This is the moment Bear can no longer pretend he doesn't understand what's happening. The illusion is over. He knows exactly what's happening. She's imprisoned and he has the ability to free her. But instead he asks, "What's so bad about being with me?" It becomes immensely clear in this moment that even though Bear has been trying to get himself out of this wish, or at least the undesirable parts of it, he does not care who it hurts as long as he is happy in the fantasy. Bear does not hear a human being calling out for help. He hears his crush rejecting him and penetrating the bubble he's been living in. He's finally face to face with the reality he's been running from since the beginning of the film. Much like when she asked him initially if he liked her, Bear did not want to be forced to confront or deal with his own feelings of inadequacy. Letting Nikki go would force him to face the truth. That none of this was ever real. That she never chose him. And she never could. This is where the danger of Bear's passivity and inaction really comes to light. Because in the beginning of the film, it seems like a quirky trait which he has to overcome in order to get the girl he likes. But now it is serving as the tool used to maintain her suffering. He delays action, attempts to adjust the wish without completely ending it, and tries to manage the consequences without ending the fantasy. He is unconcerned with how Nikki feels, and rather how he can keep her without the self-defecation, the cooking of the cat, and yelling in the restaurant. Bear's indifference can look like kindness and consideration, until it becomes clear that it's a mask for his dark and deeply selfish desires. One of the reasons Obsession affected me so deeply is because despite all of its supernatural horror, it never stopped reminding me of something very real. And that's performance. The film speaks volumes about how women are expected to navigate relationships and this world in general. There is a level of performance that we often feel pressured to give in order to keep ourselves safe. Now, obviously, Nikki's situation is exaggerated. She is literally physically imprisoned as an observer inside her own body, unable to control it. But exaggeration has always been one of horror's greatest tools. It takes an emotional truth and pushes it until it becomes impossible to ignore. Watching Nikki slowly disappear under the version of herself that Bear wanted reminded me of someone. Me. When I was in college, I had a guy friend who made it very clear that he liked me. I didn't feel the same way, but he never actually asked me out directly. Instead, he created situations where I was expected to play along. He'd put his arm around me, try to massage my shoulders, spread himself across my bed while we were hanging out and jokingly ask me to lie down next to him. One time, he insisted on putting his jacket around me, and I remember feeling his hands brush across my chest as he wrapped it around my shoulders. It lasted only a second. Maybe he didn't even realize what he'd done. But I noticed, and I remember it. The important part isn't trying to determine whether every single interaction crossed some legal or moral line. The important part is recognizing the emotional position I found myself in. I didn't want to create drama. I didn't want to embarrass him. I didn't want to make our mutual friends uncomfortable. So sometimes I laughed. Sometimes I stayed quiet. Sometimes I gave the appearance that everything was fine. Not because I was comfortable, but because maintaining peace often felt easier than confrontation. This friend of mine was not some outspoken misogynist. In fact, he often projected himself as a feminist, someone that was safe to be around, and I genuinely don't think that he was trying to be malicious in his interactions with me. Instead, I think he was lonely. He was probably convinced that persistence would eventually change my feelings, and I think that one of the biggest mistakes we make when talking about harmful behavior is assuming there are only two categories: monster or good person. But life rarely works that way, because most harm isn't committed by cartoonish villains. It's committed by ordinary people who convince themselves they're justified in their actions. Bear isn't trying to torture Nikki, and he actually believes he's finally receiving the love he's always wanted. My friend probably believed he was being romantic. Neither changes the impact, because someone else's experience isn't determined solely by our intentions. It's determined by how our actions affect them. And that's a much harder truth to live with, because it demands self-examination over self-defense. One thing I don't think enough films acknowledge is how often women become responsible for managing men's emotions. Not because they want to, but because they learn it's safer. If a stranger won't stop talking to you, you smile. If someone asks for your number, sometimes it's easier to give a fake one than risk angering him. If a friend clearly has feelings you don't return, you may soften every rejection. Women are often socialized to prioritize harmony over honesty, to avoid conflict, to avoid seeming rude or being labeled mean. Obviously, this doesn't describe every interaction, nor does every man respond badly to rejection. But enough women recognize this balancing act that it has become almost instinctive. And that's what Nikki's possession externalizes, because she no longer has the ability to stop performing once Bear makes his wish. There are other amazing films that I think beautifully explore this tricky way of life that women have to navigate. One of them is Anna Kendrick's directorial debut, Woman of the Hour. If you haven't seen it, it's on Netflix, and I highly recommend it. It essentially follows how a serial killer in the 70s finds himself on a dating game show, and how the woman who wins a date with him learns to become more assertive and challenge the men around her rather than folding to their needs. It's based on a true story, by the way, believe it or not. Throughout the film, almost all the women, from the killer's victims to the witnesses, and Anna Kendrick's character Cheryl, repeatedly ignore their own discomfort in order to avoid upsetting men. The misogyny isn't always loud. Sometimes it's subtle. Casting directors casually discussing an actress's body while she's standing in the room. A woman agreeing to spend more time with a man and sleep with him because she doesn't want to appear unkind. And even when she begins realizing she's sitting across from someone dangerous, her instinct to get away is covered by trying to explain herself, to justify why she's leaving, and overall, nice her way out of the situation. It's not a defect or a weakness. It's how we as women are conditioned to respond to discomfort. And obsession turns that conditioning into literal imprisonment. Another example is Ridley Scott's The Last Duel, which approaches something similar from a completely different direction. The film tells the story of one of the last duels that occurred in France over the claims a woman made of being raped. Like Woman of the Hour, it is also based on a true story. But this one takes an interesting route by telling the same story 3 times. Once through the victim's husband's perspective, the other through her attackers, and finally through the woman herself, Marguerite's. The first 2 versions reveal something fascinating. Neither man believes he's lying. Each sincerely believes his own version of events. But when Marguerite finally tells the story, we understand how completely both men failed to see her, not because they hated her, because they were too busy seeing themselves. While her husband was concerned with making her the proper wife and producing an heir, her attacker was concerned with taking her for himself and winning her affections. And that's Bear. Everything we experience in obsession comes through his emotional reality, his loneliness, his embarrassment, his longing, his fear. But the longer the movie goes, the more Nikki's reality emerges into the narrative. And suddenly we realize that in the midst of initially sympathizing with the protagonist, we'd been watching someone else's nightmare unfold, and it's one of his making. Ultimately, while the body can survive objectification for a period, the soul cannot. Every lie that is told, every violent act, every moment her life is on pause for this man. She sinks a little deeper beneath the version of herself that exists solely for him. And that's something many women watching can relate to. There's one moment in obsession that completely changes how we understand the movie. And it happens so quickly that it's easy to overlook. Bear, at this point, is desperate to undo what he's done, buys the remaining One Wish willows, and recruits Ian to help him. After hearing Bear's ridiculous story, Ian does not believe him and even tries to prove him wrong by wishing for $1 billion. And the wish works immediately. Money rains from the ceiling. There's no strings attached, no supernatural twist, no ironic punishment, just $1 billion. And I think that single moment reveals the film's entire thesis, because it tells us something incredibly important, that the toy isn't cursed. The wish is. When you compare the 2 men's wishes, there's inherent differences. After all, money is an object. It doesn't have feelings. It doesn't possess autonomy. It cannot consent. And giving Ian money violates no one else's freedom. So whatever consequences come from suddenly becoming unimaginably wealthy will be the result of Ian's own choices afterward. The toy simply creates the opportunity. The morality belongs to the person making the wish. Bear's wish is different. He doesn't ask for something. He asks for someone. Specifically, he asks for someone else's desire. The only way that wish can come true is by taking something away. The toy isn't punishing Bear for being selfish. It's simply granting exactly what he asked for. And even though Bear keeps insisting throughout the film that he loves Nikki, it becomes clear that he is mistaking love for possession. But unlike possession, love accepts uncertainty. It's putting the needs of others before yourself. If Bear truly loved Nikki, he would have done absolutely everything he could to end that wish as soon as he realized what was going on. He would care more about her genuine happiness than the illusion of it with him. While Bear doesn't consciously set out to control Nikki, when faced with the possibility of losing that control forever, that's exactly what he chooses, over and over again. His carelessness shows itself time and time again as very destructive. We see it from the very beginning when Sandy, the cat, dies after Bear leaves his oxycodone lying around for her to reach. He didn't intend to kill her, but he did. He failed to consider how his actions could affect someone more vulnerable than himself. He doesn't mean to use and dismiss the waitress in the beginning of the movie. He doesn't need to kill the cat. He doesn't mean to destroy Nikki. He doesn't mean to traumatize Sarah. He doesn't mean for Ian to die, but he is responsible for all of it, just the same. And that same carelessness comes back to claim him. He dies, and tries to escape the trap he's created for himself and Nikki by the very same pills that introduced us to his inability to take responsibility. If I could step into the beginning of this movie and speak directly to Bear before he ever breaks that toy, I wouldn't tell him to become more aggressive. or try to manipulate Nikki into liking him. I would say, learn to like yourself and take responsibility for your life. Because if your entire sense of worth depends on one person saying yes, then you're asking them to carry a weight they were never meant to bear. And that temptation isn't exclusive to men. Women can objectify men. Parents can objectify children. Friends can objectify one another. Anyone can reduce another human being into a means of satisfying their own emotional needs. The film chooses romance because romance is where that temptation often hides beneath the language of love. And at the end of the day, love isn't valuable simply because someone chooses us once. It's valuable because they continue choosing us, through the conversations and disagreements, through the good days and the bad days, without obligation or fear. And that's why Obsession isn't really a movie about obsession. It's a movie about choice, or more accurately, the horror of losing it.